Hey, it's Nexus. Think about the last time someone told you to quit. Maybe it was a person you trusted, someone who knew you well enough to say it out loud. And something in you, quietly, firmly, said no. Not loudly, not with an argument ready, just a quiet refusal that was already decided before the words finished landing. You kept going. Now, here's the question nobody asked you after that. Were you right to? This isn't about giving up, and it's not about whether you made the right call. It's about something nobody taught you to ask. Because there are two very different things you might have been holding on to in that moment. The direction, where you were actually trying to go, or the way you've been going, the specific path, the specific version of how you'd been doing it. From the inside, in that moment, they feel the same. They feel like the same thing. What exactly are you refusing to give up on? The direction or the way you've been going?
Every channel has an answer for this. Determined people focus on the goal. They adapt their methods. Stubborn people lock onto the method and won't move. Seems clean. Until you realize everyone who's being stubborn thinks they're being determined. Not the method, the goal. They're sure of it. So the definition sounds clear, but it assumes you can tell from the inside right now which one you're doing. It assumes you have access to something, a clean read on your own motivations that you may not actually have. Because here's the structural problem. This distinction can only really be seen clearly after the outcome is known. The same behavior reads as determination if it leads somewhere. It reads as stubbornness if it doesn't. Before the outcome, from inside it, the two states feel identical. They use the same language. They come with the same certainty. Which means the question, am I stubborn or determined, isn't just hard to answer. It was the wrong question to begin with.
So let's ask a different one. If you can't tell from the inside, can someone on the outside tell for you? Researchers noticed something about this in the early 1970s. When you're the one acting, you see the situation around you, the pressure you're navigating, the context, everything you're carrying that nobody else can see. When someone watches you act, they see you, your pattern, your persistence, your character. Not because they're reading you wrong, because they physically cannot access what's driving you. And this gap shows up most in exactly this kind of moment, when the behavior looks unusual from outside, and when the outcome hasn't been decided yet. That's when it's widest. The observer sees the behavior. They can't feel what's moving it. That gap between what's visible and what's true is where the label lives. But there's another layer here that's harder to measure. The people watching you, they're not neutral instruments either. Someone who needs you to stop sees something different than someone who's inspired by you. Same behavior, different position, different label. The same persistence. On Tuesday, one person calls it stubbornness. On Wednesday, another calls it inspiration. You didn't change. They did. The observer isn't lying. They're just using contaminated data. Contaminated data being the scientific term for what happens when someone who loves you is also exhausted by you. So the people around you cannot answer this for you. Not because they don't care, because they don't have access to what you'd need them to see. Which brings us to a harder question. The outsider can't tell. Can the insider? You know why you're doing this. You can feel it. Except, the more you've invested, the harder it becomes to see the investment clearly. In 1985,
researchers found that when people had already put significant resources into a project, 85% of them kept going, even when a clearly better option was right in front of them, with full information, no ambiguity. Because they had already invested. The investment was the reason. We call it stubbornness when they fail. We call it vision when they succeed. The behavior was the same. We just changed the caption. And here's what makes it harder. The research shows this effect is strongest when the original decision was yours. When the choice was yours, backing down doesn't just feel like losing what you've put in. It starts to feel like a judgment about your judgment. Because somewhere in the calculation, the question stops being, is this still the right path? And starts being, was I right to start? And those are very different questions with very different costs. Not just a lost investment, a verdict. In 1985, a board member described Steve Jobs as uncontrollable. He got ideas in his head, and that was that. The board voted him out. 12 years later, when Apple was near bankruptcy and Jobs returned, the same person called him visionary, ahead of his time. What changed was the outcome. And there are people who kept going just like that, who held the same conviction, refused the same pressure, persisted through the same doubt. And we never heard about them. Not because they failed quietly, because failure doesn't become a story. The ones who kept going and lost are unnamed. That's not an accident. That's how the record works. So you don't know how your story ends yet. And because you don't, you cannot borrow certainty from an outcome that hasn't happened. This isn't about being weak, and it isn't about being irrational. What comes next is structural. It happens because you're human, not because something is wrong with you. When you've invested enough in something, a project, a direction, a version of yourself who is doing this, it stops being something you do. It becomes something you are. When that happens, stepping back doesn't feel like reconsidering a strategy. It feels like losing a piece of yourself you were counting on still being there. Researchers who study identity and continuity describe exactly this. When a path you've built yourself around gets disrupted, the response isn't just disappointment. It activates the same defenses as a threat to the self. Not metaphorically, structurally. The same internal systems that protect you from harm are now protecting you from a decision. Are you protecting a direction or protecting yourself from being wrong? There's one more layer, and this one is harder to sit with. The word stubborn is often used not to describe a behavior. It's used to end a conversation. It's what we say when we want someone to stop, and we have enough standing to make the label stick. This is what the research shows. The label doesn't fall evenly. In workplace studies, 75% of women receive negative personality criticism in performance reviews. Pushy, stubborn, watch your tone. Men receive the same feedback 1% of the time. Same behavior, different label. What's different is not the behavior. What's different is who has the power to name it. Which means asking others whether you're stubborn or determined is asking people who are holding contaminated instruments. They can't give you a clean reading. Not because they're wrong, because the instrument is built that way. So here is what the episode has been building toward. Both sides are working with corrupted data. The observer doesn't have your internal state. You don't have a clear signal because investment and identity have been shaping it. The question wasn't unanswerable because it's hard. It was unanswerable because both instruments, the one outside and the one inside, were reading from a compromised source. That's the honest picture. From that picture, 3 questions, one for each layer. Are the people around you working with complete information, or just the parts they can see? Are you still doing this because you believe in it, or because you've already paid too much to stop? Are you protecting a direction, or protecting yourself from being wrong? One of those 3 felt heavier than the others. That's the one that matters. Not because it has an answer, because it has the right shape to hold what you're actually carrying. Nobody outside can tell you which one you're doing, not because they don't care, but because they don't have access and the information is yours. That asymmetry, the gap between what's visible and what's true, is not a flaw in how we work. It's a feature of how this particular question works. The answer lives in a place that is structurally inaccessible from outside, which means the only person who could ever get close to it is you. Not all the way to it, not cleanly, but closer than anyone else could. And maybe that's worth something. Not as comfort, not as a solution, just as an honest map of where you actually are. Maybe that's the point. Which one felt familiar?